This is my first opportunity to meet our speaker today. PDG Leon Hirsch is a native of Cincinnati, Ohio. Following his graduation from the Kentucky Military Institute, he obtained a degree in psychology from Transylvania. The blizzard of '78 drove him to Pensacola, Florida. I can relate to that. I remember that blizzard, where he was joyfully experienced 6 major hurricanes. See, there's just no getting away from Mother Nature. My husband always says Mother Nature always wins, and I think that's proof positive. His classification is Certified Financial Planner, and he is employed by Benjamin F. Edwards and Company, the rebirth of the 120-year-old A.G. Edwards and Sons of St. Louis, Missouri. He is on a recruiting trip this week. When not working, Leon has trained assistant governors at Florida Pets, and he now holds the position of a discussion leader trainer for the Rotary Leadership Institute's Sunshine Division. His program today is the Fight for the Oral Polio Vaccine, and it has been presented to 95 clubs in 7 states. So help me welcome Leon Hirsch.
Thank you, Paula and Fred. Glad to be here, just tickled to be here. We all need to smile because we're going to be on candid camera before the day's over, are we not? Okay. And the back table I've already had a word with. You want to see the screen. It's just like going to church in Pensacola. You know, the top 2 tables, there's nobody there, afraid of the pastor throwing erasers and also want you to be able to see this. Yeah, you all are club number 95. I'm extremely grateful for Pokey and Tom Ashford to have picked me up this morning from Lexington and bring me up here. Tom and I go back a long way. We are fraternity brothers from the Pi Kappa Alpha chapter of Transylvania, and it wasn't until many years later that we both figured out that we were just a little bit involved with Rotary along the way. So hope you enjoy the program. I'm going to take you down a little trip along memory lane from my hometown, and I promise you that at the end of the program, we'll be right where we need to be, and we'll have a little better idea why we meet once a week. All right? So let's take a little roll down through Cincinnati. That's what the skyline looked like after World War II. It wasn't very pretty, was it? All the natural resources had gone to the war effort. Compared to today, which is absolutely gorgeous, and you see the 2 stadiums there where the Bengals and the Reds attempt to play their respective sports during the year. Boy. But Cincinnati is known for a lot of things, and we're going to start out talking about business a little bit. When I was in 8th grade history class at Gamble Junior High School, we learned it was Ohio history. And I learned back then that by 1860, Cincinnati was the 4th largest city in the country, okay? And a few years later, it would get the nickname Porkopolis because it became one of the largest meatpacking centers in the whole country. The Conn's factory, you all probably remember Conn's, they had it down here, went as far as the eye could see at the plant. They finally tore it down in 2012, and it merged with Hillshire Farms, which is a company that you see in the kiosks in the malls during the holidays, okay? But Conn's was huge, and what made them really famous up there, they had baseball cards made. So you could get a baseball card of the Cincinnati Reds a lot easier in a pack of Cons than you could with Topps, Fleer, or whatever when you lived up there in Cincinnati. And if you go look on eBay or Amazon, if you've collected some over the years and still have them, they are worth some money. But in order to become one of the world's largest meatpacking centers, you had to have rails. Started with freight, then came the passenger rails in and out of there. Then they built this absolutely gorgeous Union Terminal. How many of you all have been there? Today it's a museum of natural history. They've got a scale model, electric, of the city going back to the 1940s with working cable cars. Gorgeous place. So even through the mid-1960s, the rails were still the major form of transportation coming in and out of Cincinnati, which is quite a testament to the rail progress there. Like Detroit with Stroh's, like Milwaukee with Miller, Ham, Schlitz, PBR, and Blatz. Louisville, let me see if I can get these right. Fairs, Falls City, Sterling, and Earl's 92. Did I miss anybody? Okay, Cincinnati was partially built on beer. Hudipole was one of the largest breweries around. I remember when I was a kid growing up, and Mom and Dad would take me to Crosley Field to see the Reds. The vendors would strap on a case of Hudipole on their hips and walk up and down the stairs between the aisles yelling, "Get moody with Hudy." So we had Hudipole and Burger, Wiedemann, that they used to brew up at Newport. Heilman bought them and moved them to Evansville. Shaneling, we could still get Little Kings down in Pensacola once in a while. But what really started to kick off business in Cincinnati after World War II was GE. GE got one of the first contracts to build the new J engines for our jet aircraft for the military, okay? So that started about 1950, all right? And I know they've been in the headlines. The finance division's had a little problem over the last few years, but they could still go off to the Dubai Air Show and come back with $40 billion worth of engines and parts and all that. Tremendous employer for the greater Cincinnati area. And if you all have driven up north, up I-75, it's up at the Evendale exit on the north side of the county. Kroger would become a national powerhouse of food and consumer staples. They built that building, which is still there in the late 50s. It started the whole urban renewal process from the north side of Cincinnati after World War II ended. Procter & Gamble on the east side of Cincinnati, from very humble beginnings, all of a sudden they came up with a hit product, and you all are going to remember it. Who remembers Ivory soap? What was the slogan? You know what? You all got that part right. 99 and 44 100% pure. That's the tough part. The easy one was, it floats, right? Did it make it any better? I don't know, but it floated and it was supposed to be really pure. When you look at all the products that have come and gone under the Procter & Gamble label over the last several years, an amazing company it's turned out to be, and its headquarters is now on the east side of downtown Cincinnati. So the product manufacturer, Procter & Gamble, the product distributor, Kroger, the headquarters for both companies are separated by about a mile of road known as Central Parkway on the north side. I think that's probably was planned a little bit more than it was just being a coincidence. Well, not to be outdone by the brewers, Seagram's and Shenley were going to give us opportunities to get moody with a lot more than Hudy. Halfway up I-75 between downtown and the GE plant, Seagram's and Shenley put up plants there, and they stayed there for a long time, and then they were lured over to Lawrenceburg, Indiana. Those were some of the brands that they used to crank out up there. The Dracut Chemical Company was making Windex and Drano when I was growing up there, and over the course of the years, Dracut is now part of the S.C. Johnson conglomerate, okay? And who could ever forget riverboating? How many of you have been on one of the steamships? Pretty cool stuff. And I understand they've just brought back the rivalry between the Delta Queen and the Belle of Louisville before the Derby. So I'm excited to see that too. If you look at culture, as we get through into the 50s to 60s, how many have been to Music Hall up there to see the Pops Orchestra or the Cincinnati Symphony? Fabulous place. The building's on the National Historical Registry. They did so much to help the school children with their music. Those of us that grew up playing the Dolmetsch recorder in school, my 6th grade class out of Westwood School actually played a performance with the symphony downtown in an evening, and that's just something that a child will never forget. You get an opportunity to do that. We had great theaters downtown, the Grand, the Albee, the Keith, the Schubert, and in the late 50s, Cincinnati expanded and equipped these theaters so that the big Broadway plays could come into town instead of us just always having to run up there to see a play. Who's that? Who said Pearl Bailey? Okay, you're the 12th out of 95 that's gotten that right. Okay. Got a hug from her at the Albee Theater when I was 10 years old on stage after a performance. The Albee was just on the south side of the fountain, okay? What a fabulous entertainer. If there's any youngsters in here that don't know who she is, go look up some of her performances on YouTube. Absolutely one of the best entertainers we have ever seen, okay? The zoo. When I was a kid, we didn't get out of school till the end of the second week of June, so the first Tuesday in June was Zoo Day, and if you belonged to the public school system, you got a day off and got to go to the zoo. One of the greatest zoos on the planet, and I think their toughest job is to annually vie with bragging rights with San Diego to see who's got the best zoo on the planet, okay? So culturally, things are coming along. Business after World War II, things are really starting to zip along. If you were a sports nut, Cincinnati was a good place to be, and you're going to get all these right. Who's that? Roger Staubach. Came out of Purcell High School in Cincinnati, did a year at New Mexico Military Institute, then off to the Naval Academy, Heisman Trophy, you know the rest, Dallas Cowboys. This one's a little bit tougher, but you're going to get this too. Who's that? What was his nickname? The Big O. Okay. He came out of Indianapolis, little 17-year-old kid, made the trek down to UC, and just turned the world of college basketball on its ear. You know, the big men were starting to take over. Bill Russell came out of University of San Francisco, went on to the Celtics, you know, the big center. Will Chamberlain at Kansas came right after that. And then here comes a point guard who helps lead a trek of 5 consecutive trips to the Final Four for the UC Bearcats. They were the first team to do that, okay? If you follow pro basketball today, you'll see that Oscar Robertson has an NBA record called the triple-double, and after 40 years, Russell Westbrook is in hot pursuit. If he stays healthy, he's probably going to catch him. But that's a great record that lasted for a long time. Here is my hero growing up, Frank Robinson, rookie year 1956. What's wrong with that baseball card? Because that baseball card is worth some money. It's got a picture of Ted Kluszewski crossing home plate after a home run instead of Frank Robinson. That was a bit of an error, okay? But he stayed with him for 10 years, got him into the World Series for the first time during my life, 1961. But that was a year that Maris hit 61, Mantle hit 54, and the Reds went home in 5 games. But then it's chronicled one of the worst trades in the history of baseball. 1966, they sent him to Baltimore for 3 players that nobody can remember anymore. And he went on to win the Triple Crown and led Baltimore to the World Series championship just in that first year. So he's had my respect since he started when I was a 6-year-old. That's what Crosley Field looked like when I was growing up and going there, and you could sit in the sun deck for 50 cents. Can you believe it? Anybody tell me who that is? That's a good guess, but incorrect. Look at the C up there. That's going to kind of throw you off a little bit. That's Hall of Famer Sandy Koufax, all right? See the C on his cap? In 1954, he was pitching for the University of Cincinnati, and they let him get away to the Dodgers. Can you believe it? This is the toughest part of my program. It's been 65 years, and I need to get over this. You know? Same thing with the Robinson trade, 53, 54 years, I need to get past this, and it's always been tough. So, again, so much going on in Cincinnati after World War II, coming up to about 1960. Business and culture and sports, but beyond that, boy, there was something going on that people weren't going to find out for a while, but what an impact it was going to have. Let me introduce you to young Al Saperstein. Grew up in Bialystok, Russia, born there in 1906. Okay, year before my dad was born in Toledo. So he and his family come over on the boat to Paterson, New Jersey in 1921. They picked a very timely time to come. Anybody remember what was going on in Russia in 1921? They were 4 years into the Bolshevik Revolution. It was pretty ugly. A lot of people were dying. Bad news. So they get over there, and fortunately, young Al and his family have got some family that's already in Paterson. So he's 15 years old, and he's got 2 cousins that taught him how to speak English. He didn't know anything. And they did such a good job, he was able to immediately enroll Paterson, New Jersey High School and finish his high school education. How about that? So the plot thickens. He applies to NYU and gets accepted. Now, his uncle, the father of those 2 boys who taught him English, was a prominent dentist already in Paterson, New Jersey. And he got a hold of Al and said, young Al, I would love it if you went to dental school at NYU. You could come into the family business with me. We could work. And then when I decided to retire, I could leave you the business. What do you think? He said, Unc, I'm going to give it my best shot. So he did that for 2 years. And he went back to his uncle and he said, you know, Unc, I've really tried at this, and dentistry's great and all, but it's just not where my passion is. I want to look at those nasty viruses under the microscope. That's the only place where you can see them. I want to fight those things. I want to knock those things out. And that's where I want to take my career. And his uncle said, okay. I told you I'd bankroll your entire college education if you went to dentistry school, but since you're not, I'm cutting you off. So, after that, young Al had to become a lab technician and take some other part-time jobs to get through school, but he graduated from med school with honors at NYU, got an appointment as a residency at Bellevue Hospital. A year later, he gets to go to the Lister Institute in England and look at all those nasty European strains of the viruses that he wants to study. Then he comes back and he gets appointed to the Rockefeller Institute, which is now Rockefeller University, and kind of becomes an assembly line virologist. You know, they've got a bunch of them up there at this time, and now we're talking the mid-1930s. And then a miracle happened. I guess I should tell you that by this time, they had shortened and changed the family name to Sabin. Okay? William Cooper Proctor, grandson of one of the original founders of Procter & Gamble, gave the Cincinnati Children's Hospital enough money to build its first foundation. That's it in all of its humble glory. They needed somebody to run it. Young Al Saperstein, now Albert Sabin, applied for the job, and he got it. So by 1939, right up here in Cincinnati, we had Dr. Albert Sabin running the Cincinnati Children's Hospital Foundation. How cool is that? So now he's free to work on whatever he wants, but the war is going to hit him first. He goes into the Army and immediately gets put on the Army's virus board. I think that was a bit of a no-brainer. He worked his way up to lieutenant colonel, and in the worst war in the history of the planet, he's going all over the world trying to knock out disease. He comes up with vaccines for Japanese encephalitis, dengue fever, and sandfly fever. Who could ask for more? The war ends. He comes back to Cincinnati. They give him his old job back running the foundation there for Cincinnati Children's Hospital. The University of Cincinnati also makes him its director of pediatric research at the medical school. And he turns around and starts their virology and pathology department for him. So 1947, 1948, life's pretty good for young Al Sabin. And one day he's walking up the banks of the Ohio River, looking up east, up into the mist, and he sees the outline of somebody he's going to get to know real well. Who's that? That's Dr. Jonas Salk, all right? He was a lot younger than Albert. Similar story, came over on the boat, had a name change, studied virology, and he was doing a lot of things at the University of Pittsburgh that Dr. Sabin was doing at the University of Cincinnati, okay? And he didn't go off to the war, so he had a little bit more time to be in the laboratory and study, okay? These two guys would become colleagues. Their staffs would become bitter enemies. And this would go on for several years. This wasn't like the hype and all the mudslinging the week before the UK Louisville football game. All right, it goes a little bit deeper than that. Both the camps didn't think the other camp's polio vaccine was going to work. They went on the record and said, it's dangerous, it's going to kill people, it's not going to work. But by 1954, Doc Salk had successfully inoculated 1.8 million people. Now, everybody, we haven't had a case of polio here in the U.S. since 1977, okay? For those of you that don't remember about it, it's fecal-borne. It's very easy to transmit. You don't have to exhibit symptoms to be a carrier. One of the two setbacks we had in Nigeria years ago, somebody came into Nigeria that was a carrier and didn't know it, gave polio to a bunch of people, and we had to track him all the way to the Philippines before we could get him quarantined. That's how nasty it was, all right? So these two guys went at it, and it wasn't until 1954 that Doc Sabin was ready for his first human clinical trial. And he went up to Chillicothe, Ohio, north of Cincinnati, and gave the vaccine to everybody at the Chillicothe Reformatory. Promised them a $25 check and a reduced sentence, all right? So, it worked, but by that time, Doc Salk had so many government agencies behind him, and rightfully so. They had inoculated 1.8 million kids. He should have gotten his virus vaccine on the market first, which he did, okay? 1955, it gets approved. Now, there's differences in the formula. Dr. Salk takes a live polio vaccine, kills the whole thing with formaldehyde, basically, and that's what he uses to create the injectable vaccine, all right? Where Doc Sabin was using a strand of the wild polio virus, not killed, okay, that they put into the original sugar cubes, the drops that we had in the 1960s, okay? So we had two different formulas. So think about this. Think about the four-way test a little bit. Doc Salk gets his vaccine on the market. Now, one would think by today's standards that Doc Sabin would be able to continue to test his vaccine until they get enough results to where they could make a determination whether or not to approve it. Didn't happen. They kicked him downriver and told him he could no longer test the oral polio vaccine in the United States. Can you believe it? How did that happen? I know that there are a couple of groups that were just so adamant about the Sabin vaccine, one of them being the infantile paralysis group and their foundation, which later became March of Dimes. There was a lot of influence going on, probably some dollar signs. It's an injectable. You have to have a medical professional do that. Who knows? But here we are, starting 1956. Frank Robinson's getting ready to embark on that terrific rookie year. Pearl Bailey's entertaining people all over the country. And Doc Sabin's going to be standing there with his arms up going, what happened here? But he wasn't idle for long. He went back to NYU, to the med school. Some of his classmates from medical school were Russian, and they had become pretty good virologists in their own right back in Russia, all right? So while Nikita Khrushchev was at the UN pounding a shoe on the podium, remember telling everybody he was going to bury us? Albert Sabin and his Russian virologist cohorts had created millions of vaccines, the oral vaccine, and they started inoculating everybody in Russia, half of Eastern Europe, Mexico, Turkey, Iceland, all over the place. So now they've got results coming in from all over the world outside the US. It's going to prove that it's going to work, okay? But in the meantime, there's a little trouble in paradise back in the States. Doc Salk had farmed his vaccine out to major pharmaceutical companies. You have to remember, these guys could have been instant billionaires almost overnight at relatively young ages, but they gave up their patents for the good of medical science. The big pharmaceutical companies like Lilly and Park Davis and Wyeth and all, they had voiced concern to Dr. Salk that they weren't sure that they were always getting rid of the live polio vaccine with the formaldehyde. They weren't sure, okay? Dr. Salk didn't have any problem with it. He did 1.8 million vaccinations with children before the approval and didn't have any problem at all. But for some reason, the pharmaceutical companies were having issues with it. There were a couple of small pharmaceutical companies as well that were given this. The Cutter incident is something I'm just going to give you a headline on. You can go look at this on the web, okay? Family-owned Cutter Pharmaceuticals out of California, been around since the 1890s. There was a contamination. We had severe paralysis on 200 children. 10 deaths in the western states. They were bragging about there were so few deaths. I think you lose one child, it's a tragedy. You don't brag about it. But that also took in 40,000 total new cases of polio off that Cutter incident in several western states. Can you believe it? So Doc Sabin is using the oral vaccine successfully on millions of children throughout Europe and Eastern Europe and all, while this knucklehead's up there telling us he's going to bury us, okay? So finally, our federal government goes back to Albert and says, you know, maybe, just maybe, we were a little hasty kicking you downriver like we did, if you'll come help us clear up this mess, this tragedy out in the western states with Cutter Pharmaceuticals, we're going to let you start testing the oral polio vaccine again. By the way, Albert, do you have a group that you already are ready to train and to test all this? He said, yeah, I've got all 180,000 kids in the Cincinnati public school system ready to go. So he did, it took, and by 1962, 7 years later, it finally got approved, okay? We're down to Afghanistan and Pakistan. The mountainous areas between those two countries are really tough. We've lost over 160 polio AIDS workers who were murdered by radical Taliban who thought the vaccine was either going to kill or sterilize their children. So partly it's an educational process, it's working with governments, okay? Working with regional militias where you need to, but we're getting it done. And I think logistically, we could say that as great as the Salk vaccine is, and they've used it all over the world for decades, okay, and it's been reformulated and they're using it again. If we wanted to get within 100 cases on the planet like Rotary is, it was going to take an oral vaccine that didn't need a medical professional to administer, okay? So, things took off in 1962. Come 1967, where's Doc Sabin? He's down in Cuba. He's working with Cuban scientists, trying to come up with a distribution pact for the entire Caribbean region, which is what good scientists do. And sometimes good science trumps bad politics, all right? How many of you are seeing an iron lung for the first time? Okay, everybody's caught a picture before? Can you imagine a room full of them back in the 50s? Polio would strike your outer extremities, okay? So if you survived that, you had to be taught how to walk again. But there was a tougher version. It would hit your chest muscles so you couldn't breathe for yourself. If your parents could get you to a hospital that had an iron lung, that had a vacant iron lung, you might survive for a while the doctors tried to figure it all out. But that's how tough it used to be. There used to be a lot of paranoia. We weren't supposed to go out and play at certain times. We were supposed to stay off certain blocks. And how many of you all remember the movie Caddyshack from years ago? What's one of the greatest movie gags of all time? The Baby Ruth candy bar and the swimming pool trick, right? If they would have pulled that at Phillips Swim Club, where I grew up in Cincinnati, there was enough paranoia that in 1960 they would have shut the pool down for 6 weeks, okay? So we finally got it knocked out here in 1977. We're down to 2 countries. We're keeping our fingers crossed that Nigeria is going to be declared polio-free again for the second time now because we had a relapse. He picked up the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And you know, about 4.5 years ago, there was a segment on 60 Minutes where they were talking about a new cancer treatment based on a live strain of the polio virus. Well, this is where Doc Sabin was headed when he was called home. That's what the foundation building looks like today on the west side of town. This is what makes it important to Rotarians. This is the 1985 Rotary International Convention in Kansas City with International President Carlos Canseco of Mexico and Albert. Rotary spent 1977 and 1985 knocking polio out of the Philippines, okay? That is what gave Rotary the impetus and the courage to take it global in 1985 at the convention in Kansas City and let the world be on notice that Rotary is going to take on polio and we're going to knock it out. And 34 years later, we really are this close. We gave up Albert in 1993. Wonderful guy. His house still sits up in Cincinnati, up in Clifton. I believe there are tours. And what would we have done without him when it comes to polio? Think about it. Doc Salk and Doc Sabin, the world of polio being on their 2 shoulders, and they were separated by a few hundred miles of Ohio River. You know, quite a coincidence. That is the end of my presentation. I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed it and picked up a little bit of history. And I belong to Pensacola North Rotary. I've been there for 35 years. We have a festive club. We're always poking fun at each other. We meet on Fridays at noon right across the street from Pensacola State College. In fact, our meetings usually look something like this. So if you're ever down Pensacola way, come and join us. I've enjoyed hanging out with you today, and again, thank you for allowing me to come and present my program.